There is a constant question as a rental property investor. Should I buy single family properties or multifamily properties? And to help you kind of decide this for yourself, because the answer is there's no right or wrong. They both have pros and they both have cons. And so what I'm going to do with you today is go through this list of pros and cons so you can see a better picture of what both things offer, and maybe it'll help you kind of tailor what the answer should be for your situation. Now, a quick clarification. When you hear the term multifamily, that could technically pertain to residential multifamilies or commercial multifamilies. Residential multifamilies are 2 to 4 units, so duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. Commercial properties are 5 units and above, so a 5-plex, a 10-plex, 16-plex, large high-rise apartment building, whatever it may be. So the reason that that distinction is very important is because buying residential versus commercial in general is not a debate within itself, but there's pros and cons to those also, and that's a different conversation. So the pros and cons we're going through today are really, I mean, they do pertain to the larger multifamilies also, but I'm thinking mostly in terms of smaller ones. So to help do this, I'm going to share my screen here so we can get kind of a visual situation going on here. Okay, so I have broken down the different factors that are involved in a rental property, and essentially they all impact your bottom line and they all impact your experience. And we're going to go through each of them and see which one is better as far as single family or multifamily for that particular factor. Okay, first one, purchase price. The reason this is advantageous with multifamilies is because ultimately you depend, all caveated on what and where you're buying. But for the most part, you're going to get each unit cheaper than if you were to buy them individually. So for example, if you buy a triplex, which has 3 units, let's say you get those 3 units for $60,000 a piece. Whereas if you buy 3 single family houses, you're going to pay more than that. So you're getting each unit for cheaper than you would be if it were an individual unit. Does that make sense? Sounded clear as mud in my head. Okay, so purchase price is usually nice because you get each unit cheaper. It's just like the concept of buying in bulk and why we all shop at Costco. Maintenance cost. In theory, maintenance costs should be better on multifamilies because of the shared walls. So you're not having to repair or do maintenance on 3 solely individual properties. You're doing it on the property as a whole. For instance, 1 roof on a triplex versus 3 roofs on 3 single family properties. So that's just obvious. Location. You may not know what I mean by location. What I mean by this is multifamilies are very handy because you only have to drive to 1 address or tend to 1 address in order to tend to your building. Versus if you have 3 single family houses, they might be scattered all over the place. So like, I mean physical location to go to the property. Just that simple. Management. Again, same as location, you're managing 1 building instead of 3. Yeah, you have 3 different sets of tenants, but it is still under 1 building. So it leads to the next thing of paperwork. You're going to have the paperwork for the 1 property. The loan is going to be for 1 property, not 3 individual loans. It's just kind of all grouped into 1. So it makes it more simple. Vacancies. Now, this is a really interesting one. So if you buy, now, this doesn't necessarily matter if you buy 3 single family houses versus a triplex, but if you buy 1 single family house versus having a triplex, what happens is if you have a single family house and those tenants leave, you're not making any income whatsoever. Like at that point, you have to have multiple properties in your portfolio so those properties can help carry the weight of the lost income for however long that it's vacant. If you have a triplex and one of the units goes vacant, in theory, I mean, you should have the income from the other 2 units. And in theory, that should help carry that vacancy cost. So it's kind of like, it's almost like diversification, kind of. It's like vacancy diversification. I don't know if I just made that up, but it's a thing. So having diversification means that if one thing goes a little kaput for a minute, you have the other things to carry you through, and it's not all going kaput. Follow? Returns. Now, here's where it starts getting a little interesting. Oftentimes, the cash flow on a multifamily property is significantly higher than the cash flow on a single family property. Now, this is going to lead into these next factors because cash flow is only cash flow if it's actually happening. Like, you can predict cash flow all you want, but if those numbers aren't sustainable, you're never going to see those numbers. So the multifamilies tend to cash flow higher because they are riskier properties. Those two things kind of go hand in hand. But the returns on the single families can potentially be higher for things like appreciation. Like single families tend to appreciate more than multifamilies. Resale value tends to be, you know, exit strategy on a single family, which we're going to get to. You can probably resell your single family property for more than you're going to resell your multifamily. So the returns can kind of get a little split. So you have to think about it in terms of cash flow, but also the other income streams, appreciation, all that stuff. Financing, this could go either way. For a residential mortgage loan, there's not huge differences. Like there are going to be some things that are a little bit different, more logistical wise, like if it's a duplex or a triplex versus a single family. I know I just recently refied a duplex, and there were certain things that kind of came with that, and we could only get certain rates because it wasn't single family. So on one hand, the financing can be a little bit more stringent, but not in the way really that'll impact anything actually. But on the other hand, if you have a triplex, you still have one mortgage, like I said earlier, versus 3 separate mortgages. So that's why both single family and multifamily get stars, because they both have advantages in that department. Here's where we start to kind of dive into single family, if you're not already picking up on that. Tenant quality is huge for rental properties, because if you have bad tenants, I am convinced that bad tenants is, if not the most costly thing to a rental property investor. It can be deadly to an investment. You can't have tenants who are going to constantly damage your property and not pay rent and have to get evicted and on and on and on. And so again, depending on what kind of multifamily we're talking about, like if you have a really high-end triplex, this is a different conversation. But if you're talking about kind of your standard standalone single family house versus something multifamily, typically the tenant quality in a single family house tends to be a little higher. They tend to have a little bit more of like a owner's type of feeling. They want to take care of the house. Again, these are all just standard general statements, not true for every case, but they'll want to take care of the house. It just tends to attract a little higher tenant quality. And like I said, with rental properties, that is critical, because you want someone who's going to take care of your house. You want people who aren't going to move out every year. You want people who are actually going to pay you rent. So it's a big thing to think about. Tenant turnover, same thing. Like I said, you know, if you think of like cheap properties in particular markets, like those tenants are going to tend, like let's say college students. Let's go totally extreme here. Guess what college students do most every 8 to 9 months? They move. So if you have college students from like August till May, most of the time they're probably moving out in May. You may have a vacancy in summer. You've got to turn over the property. Like that is constant. How often are tenants turning over? Because I know in my properties, when I have to turn over a property, like fresh paint, all that kind of stuff, it costs me a lot. So you want tenants who are going to be there for the long haul. I've got a tenant right now who's been in that property for 8 years, I think. And honestly, she's not even my favorite tenant, but she's a long-term tenant and she pays her rent and she does have a pride of ownership of this house. And it, you know, I'm not having to turn that house over. When I have to turn that house over, it's a pretty big one. It's going to cost a lot. I don't want to do that every year or two. So always think about how you can strive for long-term tenants. I already started hitting on this exit strategy. That is, how much is the property going to be worth later? What are your options with it? Refinancing. But ultimately, a lot of it in this context comes down to the value of the property. And like I said, single families tend to appreciate more than multifamily properties. The other thing that's specific to single family versus multifamily with investors is you always want to think in terms of exit strategy of who are you going to sell this property to? So single family, you could sell it to another investor, but you could also sell it to a primary homeowner, which is huge because you can always get more money for that. Investors always want a deal. It's not going to be as likely that you sell a multifamily property to a primary home buyer. You could, but for the most part, it's probably going to be to another investor, and they always want discounts. So thinking about, you know, how much can you sell this property for later, and who can you sell it to? And then, what are we all in this for? If you're not having fun, what's the point? So whether it's single family or multifamily, again, there's not a wrong answer on this, and a lot of it really should just come down to the numbers and the risk, in my opinion. So any comparison scenario, if you're looking at a single family and a multifamily, those options, look at them in terms of the numbers and the risk, not whether they're single family or multifamily necessarily, but if you nail out the numbers and the risk, so the lowest risk you can find and the best numbers, and it'll be somewhere on that spectrum. Like, okay, you can get a little higher risk if there's higher numbers to justify it. So at the end of the day, hopefully you're having fun with all of this. And I hope that breaking those down kind of helps you, if nothing else, understand that you can go either way. There's honestly advantages to both. So like I said, just make sure you're having fun. That's the important part.